You're listening to Catholic Chicago. Ahead, the Archdiocese of Chicago brings you programs about the people, events, and issues that touch our lives. Welcome to Catholic Chicago.
Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. My name is Joyce Juriga. I'm editor of the Chicago Catholic, and this is where we take a closer look and talk to the people who are making the news that we're covering in the newspaper. So today our guest is Deacon David Keene. He's actually the Chancellor for the Archdiocese of Chicago. You're now a canon lawyer or a canonist? You're a canon lawyer. Now he's a canon lawyer. However, he spent several decades before. He's also an archaeologist and an expert at the exhumation of human remains. He's worked with, all kinds of different government agencies and entities on this kind of stuff. And he also was the archaeologist who did the exhumation for Father Tolton and then for a priest down in Tennessee. So we're not talking about his chancellor duties today. We're going to talk about his work as an archaeologist. And also he recently did his thesis dissertation, I call it dissertation, on relics and the exhumation process, and I'm very fascinated with relics and love the whole thing, so I thought he could talk about that too. So welcome, Deacon.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here.
Good. So let's start with, we talked a little bit before we went on the air about, in your dissertation, you were talking about the history of relics in the church, and it goes all the way back to the martyrs and the early church. Can you tell people a little bit about that?
Sure. In the very earliest days of the church, the early Christians began to recognize that martyrs were individuals who, for lack of a better word, were kind of possessed by the divine spirit, and so once they were dead, their bodies became objects of reverence, and when they were buried, of course, as we know from much of our early history, that people would flock often to the graveyards or to where the bodies were buried and would set up shrines of various types. And so from very earliest times, we've held these bodies as unique because essentially these are the bodies of people who are now in the divine presence, who are now in heaven. So in many ways, they have 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot here on earth. So we were talking too about, I kind of classify this as weird Catholic stuff because a lot of people, they get freaked out when they have the idea. So some of the folks know that probably know this, that some of the relics are often bones or maybe remnants of hair or whatever. And can you talk a little bit about how that process started and why we did that or do that? I think everyone needs to realize that, first of all, the real relics are body parts, some parts of the body, though over the centuries it's expanded out to pieces of cloth or other objects that have touched the body. Essentially, real relics are just human remains or pieces of a body. And so that's pretty much how we recognize those as real relics. Then the second part of your question was
why we started to separate them out.
Why do we start to separate them out? That's a good question. We separated them out as time went on, and as Christianity spread through Europe, it became more and more difficult for people in the outlying territories to get to the places where the relics were. And you have to remember, there were, even St. Augustine talks extensively about it. St. Augustine was not a fan of relics at all until the testimonies started coming in and people started visiting him who had been cured in the presence of relics. And he even had some exchange with St. Ambrose in Milan. Now, Augustine was in North Africa, and Ambrose was in Milan. And, Augustine had to change his mind because so many people who he knew were very sick would be in the presence of relics someplace in the Mediterranean world and were healed. And so as the Christianity spread through Europe, people were too far away to make the trip to visit the relics or to be in the presence of the relics. So the church began to take the bodies or separate out pieces from the bodies and send them to various churches so people could be in the presence of relics. And of course it worked. I mean, we have numerous accounts of people being cured in the presence of these relics that had been shipped to various places.
Now, we don't do the bodies anymore, right?
That's an interesting question. I have many people who ask me, why are we doing this? That isn't it a bit gruesome for us to be engaged in this kind of activity in the 21st century? And one response that I like to give is, well, your observations are correct, but we still do this because harvesting the relics or taking pieces of the relics from bodies of individuals who will be in the near future declared or canonized as saints is such a part of our heritage, such a part of our history. In order to be even today, it is kind of interesting how even today the primary reason a person becomes a saint is because they have performed a miracle,
right.
That someone has been healed. And so this concept of healing is so deep in Christianity. In fact, we have gospel stories. I mean, these go right back to the gospel, where we have the story where the woman touches Jesus's cloak as he passes by. She'd been suffering from a hemorrhage for her whole life, and she just touches the cloak. And as the Gospels describe it, Jesus feels the power leave him. I mean, it's almost, for us people of the 21st century, it's almost like science fiction that, the power, Jesus felt the power leave him and heal this individual. So throughout the past throughout 2 millennium now, that's how we've seen divine healing, is the power moving from the divine, through some sort of medium, and I use that word very loosely, in this case, through the cloak of Jesus to, heal an individual. And so we haven't given that up. It's, if anything, it's how we see that today, being in the presence of the physical remains of someone who we recognize now as a saint is a very, very powerful thing in our beliefs.
Well, and I'm thinking right now, we're for those of you who are watching or listening, we're pre-recording this, and so today's the 7th, and I'm working on a story this weekend. A relic of St. Jude is starting its U.S. tour in Chicago with a couple parishes. So we've been thinking about relics and stuff. Right now, we're in the thick of it. And if you go online right now to ChicagoCatholic.com, you can read the story because we'll have already done the story. But we also have a relic. We got a lot of relics in Chicago. We have a relic of St. Jude, and also both of them are parts of his arm bones, but down in the National Shrine of St. Jude in Pilsen. So it's such a neat, I think, reminder of then the communion of saints, and then what we can strive to be and emulate, right?
Yes. And I think it's important. It's easy for the average Catholic to miss, and for those watching or hearing what's going on, to misunderstand this. These are not talismans. They're not.
Right.
They're not charms. Even though we might find Catholics who kind of treat them as charms, put them around their neck, and but they're not charms. They're not. They're the actual remains of an individual, and they should be respected and treated with reverence as we would the remains of any human. And it's just that we recognize that these individuals are now constantly, for all eternity, in the divine presence. But it's important for us who understand to let people know the appropriate way to approach these relics, and not just collect them and and have a whole closet full of relics just in case.
Just in case.
This one for this disease, this one for this disease. That's just would not be the best way to see these things.
Well, and it's interesting to me that you got your dissertation in this because your work was so much about exhuming human remains for the state, the city, the federal government, or what have you. And then with Father Tolton, so you've been steeped in this idea of always, you talked about it in the and by the way, the interview with him will also be in this next issue, ChicagoCatholic.com. And you talked about how you and your team would always make sure you treated the remains with reverence because you were always aware that these were human beings that lived at one point and deserved that respect.
Yes, definitely. One of the someone asked me recently what was the difference between removing human remains as an archaeologist, part of a project that was being done, and then removing, especially these two individuals who were part of the cause of sainthood. And my best answer for that is the individuals I was removing, usually professionally as an archaeologist, I was rescuing them. They were going to be bulldozed if we didn't remove them, and they would no longer have a place. So we treated them with great reverence, and we, based on whatever set of laws in the area that we were doing the exhumations, it was important for us to make sure that they were placed somewhere where they were secure. But it was essentially a rescue operation. With the saints, these two saints, Father Tolton and Father Patrick Ryan, they were buried in a Catholic cemetery that was very well protected. And we were removing them, and, I would have... When you're digging as an archaeologist, you have lots of conversations with imaginary people because it's always hot, or it's just tedious work. A lot of times people see, archaeology on the television, and it looks so exciting. It really is not that exciting at all. There are exciting parts about it, but most of the day is just shoveling dirt, and dirt is everywhere. But removing Father Tolton and Father Ryan, and I said to both of them that we were asking them to come back. We're returning them to service in the church, that they cannot rest. We're pulling them out of the ground because it's time to come back. And we need them. We, the living, need their presence among us. And I think that's a powerful thing, that we're asking them to come back to serve. So,
amen. That's a good place to take a break. We're going to come back, and I want to talk to Deacon David about the whole exhumation process with Father Tolton. I got to be there, and it's one of the coolest things I've ever covered. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Catholic Charities After Supper Visions program offers guests of our Tuesday night supper the opportunity to learn the art of photography. These talented guests, who are often experiencing homelessness, are offered disposable cameras, and they work with volunteer professional photographers to learn the basics of taking photos. Then, the artists go out and capture images on film of anything they find to be beautiful or interesting in the world. Meet the artists and see their extraordinary photos at this year's After Supper Visions photo exhibition on Friday, September 22nd from 5 to 7 p.m. in Vincent Hall at 721 North LaSalle Street. That's Friday, September 22nd from 5 to 7 p.m. Visit After Supper Visions for more information. At After Supper Visions, we are developing film, talent, and hope.
I feel special. I feel great. I got good grades.
We've seen a huge surge in our kids now meeting or exceeding grade level. Come check us out. You may have never thought we were an option before.
Our school communities provide students with academic excellence and character education in a supportive and stable learning environment. Come see for yourself. Visit archchicago.org/findaschool.
Community is core to Catholic Charity's founding mission. For more than 100 years, we have met people and families where they are, serving anyone in need, regardless of their faith, gender, race, or ethnicity. As our world absorbs the economic, political, and social aftershocks of the pandemic, 50% or more of the 6 million people living in Cook and Lake counties have little or no savings. They are a paycheck away from zero. We are deeply grateful to everyone in the Catholic Charities community who partners with us to alleviate the suffering of the people we serve and offer them a better path forward. We are witnessing a message of mercy and hope to a world very much in need. Learn more at CatholicCharities.net.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. Sorry, we were chit-chatting about the exhumation of Father Tolton. So this is a funny story on how you got recruited to do that. Can you tell the story?
It is a funny story because I was already a deacon, and I was doing consulting work for the Cook County Sheriff's Police on a project. And it just so happens that one day the detective that I worked with on a lot of cases called me and said, you know, I got a call from the director of the Catholic cemeteries here in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He was telling me about needing to exhume a body, and they thought that they needed an archaeologist because they were unsure whether the cemetery people could handle what they might uncover, since they figured the body was buried in a wooden coffin and that after 100 years that coffin would probably be not be there anymore. And as he was explaining this, as the cemetery director was explaining this, the detective said, well, you know, you guys have a deacon in the Archdiocese of Chicago who's an archaeologist who does this for us all the time. And so the connections were made, and I was called. I was called by the director of the Catholic cemeteries and said, "Are you the deacon Dave Keene, who is an archaeologist?" And so it launched into asking me to help recover Father Tolton. So
Yeah, like, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for those, I hope everybody knows, because I'm a huge fan of Father Tolton and wrote a book about him, but Father Tolton was the first ordained native-born black priest for the Catholic Church in the United States. And the Archdiocese of Chicago opened up his cause for canonization. So that's a good question. That leads me to the question of, why do we exhume the bodies of saints for the cause?
Many people mistakenly think that it's done as part of the evidence that an individual was alive. And that may have been true, 1,500 years ago, where you needed evidence. But today we pretty much have all the evidence we need in the written documents about an individual. In fact, the requirements are that you have some writings of an individual or some statements that they've made or testimony about what they believed and thought. So we don't really need to have the physical evidence of the individual. It really very much is, we need the relics. We need to be able to have these relics available to us for healing purposes. They're very much part of, and the more research I did on this is, and many Catholics may not be aware that this is central to our faith. That we are people of the resurrection. We believe that our bodies will return in a physical form in the end, and so we believe that that our bodies, as temples of the Holy Spirit, now have a sort of residual dignity, and those who are now with the divine presence, those who are with God, their bodies that were temples of the Holy Spirit are with us, and so they do have that presence about them.
So during the process, if you were watching on YouTube, Mike, our producer, was showing you some photos from the exhumation. Both Karen Calloway and I went down to Father Tolton's buried in Quincy, Illinois, in the Diocese of Springfield. So we went down for the exhumation. It was the coolest thing, one of the coolest things we've ever covered. But can you talk about well, it's a big process, right? You do you identify, maybe it's going to be a long process, but can you kind of walk people through the steps of what happened? It was a very reverent thing. Everybody, when we got there, was taking an oath that they would uphold, do the best of their ability, and then there was kind of a process.
And there's an oath also to maintain some secrecy, although I don't think that's really necessary anymore. But I think knowing what I know about what would happen in the past, they didn't necessarily want. We never know what's going to happen when we open a coffin. So there's the promise of secrecy, although in the excavations, especially the most recent one with Father Ryan, I think they began publishing pictures within days. So, but with Father Tolton, it was very cold December day. The scheduled exhumation was to take place on Saturday, but we had to prepare the grave the day before. We had to remove as much dirt as we can because there's a lot of dirt. It's a very dirty,
right.
And dirt, when you're doing archaeology, dirt's always falling back into the hole. So we wanted to prepare the space and
it was deep, right?
It was deep, yeah. He was deeper than we thought because they had buried him at one level, but years later they built up a big mound, not just on top of his grave, but there's a very small section in which other priests are buried too. So they had built a little hill. And so instead of being 6 feet down, he was more like 8 or 9 feet down below the surface. And so it took a while to remove all the excess dirt. And fortunately, there was nobody buried to his right or left. And so we were able to essentially remove the dirt from 3 graves so we could approach his grave as those who were there saw us working from the side. We weren't working down on top of him. And I had explained to people that if at all possible, and this is true for any removal of any human remains, is we want the people sort of at chest level when we're removing their body. So we want to be below ground level. We want to be able to, so we can catch everything and see everything we need to see. So, and that happened pretty much with Tolton. So we got the area prepared. The next day, the cemetery personnel had put up tents because it was, I don't know, like 6 degrees outside.
It was
really cold. And it was then that we began to remove the excess earth that we knew was on top of his grave, because the day before we saw the wood that appeared to be collapsed. His grave appeared in the profile and the sides to have been crushed down to the bottom, and so we could see where the bottom was, and we began to remove that excess dirt off the top and slowly expose his skeleton, because the wood that from that coffin was all gone. But it is a slow process, and we do use hand tools, especially with human remains, because bones are brittle. We can remove the dirt in the upper levels with a shovel, but when we get closer to the individual, we have to use a trowel and stuff. So
I want to ask what this meant to you. We only have a couple minutes left. It goes so fast this time. But so I want to tell people, you can also go on, if you Google Tolton on our website and exhumation, you can read the story. And they found, what they did was they took all his remains. They were going to wash them, but it was too brittle, right? He was in clay. Yeah.
He was too brittle. It was kind of a sandy clay soil, but his bones were really pretty much being returned to the earth. The earth was taking him, and he. It seemed to me as I was I was taking his bones out and handing them to the people up who were 6 feet above me to place. You're absolutely right. They were too brittle to clean, because if we cleaned them, they would crumble. And so, but as I was taking them out, I remarked to him that I was sorry we were removing him, because he looked so peaceful, and he was clearly being returned to Mother Earth. Where most of humanity ends up back in the ground and undistinguished from the rest of the earth, and he just looked so peaceful. And I did say to him that I'm sorry, but we're calling you back into service. This is what it's all about, so that you can serve the people of God and be an example to us all. So
it was pretty amazing to know that was him. So then folks, they reassembled the skeleton, and then they vested him, and it was so beautiful, and put a pall over it. And then they put him in a casket and reburied it, and they had this service. So I had asked you this in the interview, if you can share this with folks. What did it mean to you because that was your first before you did Father?
That was my first. It was a deeply, deeply moving experience, and I can only say that it was repeated again without any, working on an excavation is like doing any kind of job. You're preoccupied, but you get that overwhelming feeling that this is something extremely special, extraordinary, and a real personal tie. I still have that. I have a personal tie to Tolton for some.
I mean, you touched his body, right?
Yeah. Well, exactly. Yes, I did touch his body.
I told you, I still wish I took some soil. But we were told not to take anything. They also found his pectoral cross and some other things.
Cross from the rosary that he had in his hand.
Yeah. So it was a truly special day.
And his Roman collar, which was extremely well preserved, which I didn't get a chance. I did pick it up, but I had gloves on. But it was so well preserved, it struck me later that, oh, wait a minute, I should take a look at that, because there was no plastic in those days. But it was gone. It was gone into the canon lawyers had their hands on it.
Right. So. Yeah, which now you are one.
And so I know what they were doing, but the archaeologist wanted to see it.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I appreciate you being on. Just real quick before we go, I just want to shout out to the newspaper. Check us out on ChicagoCatholic.com. You can subscribe for $30 a year. You can follow us on social media. We have a free newsletter that I send out a couple times a week. You can see what Cardinal Supich is up to and see our story on Deacon David and Father Tolton and all the other good things. So I super appreciate this, Deacon David. And someday we'll have you back on to talk about your work as an archaeologist. That is really cool, too.
Thank you.
So thanks so much. All right, everybody. Until next time, have a gentle and joy-filled day. Bye-bye.